In March 2026, an entire nation just went dark. And no, this isn't the plot of some disaster movie. It was the reality for 11 million people in Cuba. We're talking about a crisis on an unimaginable scale, fueled by shortages, a power grid on the brink of collapse, and, of course, decades of tension finally boiling over. So how on earth did it get to this point? Let's unpack this whole story.
You know, to really get what's happening, you have to start with the people who are living through it. This quote from Tomas, he's a resident in Havana, it just cuts right to the bone, doesn't it? This isn't about politics for him. It's about food rotting in the heat. It's about a lifetime of struggle and just being tired.
And this was the moment the world really started paying attention. March 16th. The entire island's power grid failed. I mean, can you even imagine that? A complete nationwide blackout. This wasn't just some storm knocking out power for a few hours. This was the failure of an entire system, the final straw after months of pressure. So what was that final push?
Well, the immediate trigger was immense pressure from the outside, an American blockade. Now, this was something different, something more intense than the embargo that's been in place for decades. This was aimed right at the island's lifeline, its fuel.
So here's what you need to understand. Starting in February 2026, the U.S. began to physically stop oil tankers from reaching Cuba. And the New York Times, well, they didn't pull any punches. They called it the first effective blockade since the Cuban Missile Crisis back in 1962. Just hearing that comparison alone, it tells you how incredibly serious this situation was.
And the speed at which this all happened is just staggering. Look at this timeline. It really kicked off in late 2025 when the U.S. got involved in Venezuela, which cut off Cuba's main oil supplier. Then, boom, January 2026, a direct warning from President Trump. A few weeks later, an executive order basically threatening anyone else who might help Cuba out. And by February, the physical blockade was real. It was a fast, very deliberate squeeze.
But here's the thing. A crisis like this never just pops up out of the blue. This is really the latest chapter in a story that's been going on for over 60 years. A really complex, really hostile relationship between the U.S. and Cuba.
This timeline really shows you the roller coaster ride. It all starts with that formal embargo in '62. Then, a huge shock to the system in '91 when the Soviet Union collapses, which basically bankrupted Cuba and kicked off this awful time called the Special Period. Then, you see a glimmer of hope in 2015, the Cuban thaw with Obama. But it didn't last. By 2025, the policy slammed into reverse with a maximum pressure campaign, which set the stage for exactly what we're seeing today.
So, with all that history in mind, let's go back to the ground, back to the Cuban people. Because a fuel blockade, it's not some abstract political game. It has devastating, cascading effects on every single part of daily life.
It's really like a domino effect, a society just grinding to a halt. Without fuel, you can't harvest crops or get them to the cities, water pumps can't run, hospitals can't function properly, schools have to shut down, public transit is gone. I mean, even the garbage starts piling up in the streets. This isn't just about the lights being out, it's a total systemic collapse of food, health, and sanitation. And once again, it's a voice from Havana that brings it all into focus. What UNESCO said here, it just highlights the simple, awful misery of it all. How do you get your kids to sleep in the sweltering heat when there's no power? For almost everyone in Cuba, there's no backup plan. There are no generators or rechargeable fans. There's just the dark and the heat.
Sometimes one single number tells the whole story. 41.5%. That's the share of garbage trucks in Havana that could actually run. Think about that. Less than half. It's such a clear, visible sign of how these basic services that we all just take for granted have completely broken down.
Now, as you can imagine, a crisis this severe doesn't stay local for long. The blockade and the humanitarian disaster it was causing forced countries all over the world to pick a side and make their voices heard. And as you can see, the world was completely divided. You've got countries like Argentina lining up with the U.S. But then you have major players like Brazil, China, and Russia all condemning the blockade and in some cases providing aid. Even neighbors like Mexico and Chile are sounding the alarm, with Chile calling it criminal and inhumane. And then there's the United Nations, which is officially extremely concerned.
And these weren't just empty words. The fallout was real. Airlines like Air Canada had to actually stop flying to Cuba because there was no jet fuel. Countries started ending their agreements for Cuban medical missions. And that's a huge deal because it's a major source of income for Cuba. Even a major escape route for Cubans through Nicaragua got shut down. Day by day, the island was becoming more and more isolated.
So all of this brings us to the latest chapter, where things stand now. High-stakes talks. With the island basically on its knees, the U.S. and Cuban governments started negotiating. But let's be real, the power dynamic here was incredibly lopsided.
And this quote, from President Trump, on the very day the entire island went dark, it tells you everything you need to know. I think I could do anything I want with it. It frames these talks not as a negotiation between two countries, but as one side feeling like it can dictate whatever terms it wants.
So what's actually on the table? While the U.S. demands are huge, we're talking about nothing less than regime change. They want President Díaz-Canel out, and a total shift in Cuba's political and economic system. Cuba, for its part, tried to show it was willing to talk by making a pretty big concession, agreeing to release 51 political prisoners as a sign of goodwill.
And that really leaves us with the big question, doesn't it? Is this the start of a real negotiation that could actually build a new future for Cuba, or are we just watching the end of an era, the end of a nearly 70-year-old revolution being forced to a conclusion by a global superpower? The lights will eventually come back on, but what Cuba will look like then, well, that is anything but certain.